Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that really tries to cut through the noise and get you properly informed on some pretty complex topics.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are plunging headfirst into a really layered and, let's be honest, often confusing discussion. Islam and the modern landscape of gender and sexuality.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation that's swirling out there. Lots of strong opinions, deep emotions, especially within Muslim communities around the world.
It really is. And it's not just, a niche academic debate. It affects
Wow.
real lives.
Absolutely. So we've pulled together a really unique stack of sources to help us navigate it. We'll be looking at insights from an organization that actually supports queer Muslims,
Okay.
all the way to a scholarly institute offering a more orthodox Islamic perspective, plus a broader overview of historical and contemporary views.
So real mix. Our mission today, then, is pretty clear. We want to unpack these different narratives, try to understand the assumptions driving them.
Yeah, the foundation.
Exactly. And explore the historical shifts and the modern challenges that are shaping this whole discussion.
Get ready for some, I think, quite surprising facts and maybe some profound insights that can help you, cut through the noise and see what's really going on beneath the surface.
Right. Let's dive in. So to really get a handle on the core tension here, let's start with a striking real-world incident. This was back on May 17th, 2022.
Okay.
It was Canada's International Day against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. And a Canadian university, as part of a diversity and love campaign, put up this poster.
I think I remember this.
Yeah. It depicted two Muslim women wearing hijabs, apparently about to kiss.
And the reaction, well, it was immediate, wasn't it? From many Canadian Muslims. Very strong.
Huge reaction. They saw it as a blatant appropriation, basically, taking a Muslim symbol, the hijab, and using it for something they see as explicitly prohibited in Islam.
Right. There was a big petition, demands to take it down. It really kicked off a debate.
And here's where it gets really interesting and really shows that clash of worldviews we talked about. A Western article covering this framed the protests as, and I quote, unnecessarily homophobic.
Wow.
And what's more, it even went on to suggest the Quran supposedly says nothing about homosexuality and that Islamic history depicted it as a beautiful, matter-of-fact thing.
So you have this complete disconnect. One side sees appropriation of a religious symbol for something forbidden. The other sees homophobia and misinterprets history.
Exactly. That stark contrast really highlights the core tension for this whole deep dive.
And what's truly fascinating, as our sources point out, is that this isn't just a simple disagreement. It's more like a fundamental miscommunication.
Yeah.
It stems from two radically different ways of understanding the world, two different conceptual frameworks.
Okay, explain that.
Well, on one side, you've got the theocentric worldview, which is, central to Islam. God is the ultimate source of morality, human purpose, to uphold God's commands.
Right, God and his messenger are the legislators.
Precisely. They're seen as the sole legislators of right and wrong. Islamic morality isn't just, opinion. It's deeply rooted in divine wisdom and the fiqh tradition.
That's the body of Islamic law jurisprudence.
Yes, exactly. Developed over centuries. But then you have the modern and maybe postmodern secular worldview.
Which sees things very differently.
Very differently. This paradigm often views individual sexual feeling as, almost an unassailable truth. It centers everything on individual identity, individual autonomy, usually without any reference to a higher power.
So for maybe a young Muslim growing up in the West?
For them, being gay might feel just as fundamental as immutable as being, say, Arab or South Asian. It's an identity, not just a behavior. It really highlights who gets to decide what's true and right, God or the individual self.
That fundamental difference is huge. So what happens when these two paradigms collide so directly?
Well, our sources really highlight the core challenge here, especially for many Muslims. Unlike, say, drinking alcohol or premarital heterosexual sex, which are generally understood as forbidden in Islam, but aren't exactly promoted as virtues in the West either.
Right, they're seen as maybe personal failings, but not moral causes.
Exactly. But the affirmation of same-sex relationships and transgenderism, too, is often presented in the West as a positive moral cause.
Yeah.
It's framed using powerful concepts like human dignity, justice, individual autonomy.
Which makes the traditional Muslim response seem out of step.
Yeah, or ineffective, as one source puts it, or even immoral from that Western perspective. It creates this massive communication gap.
And that difference, that gap, it leads us right into what we're calling the cultural tsunami.
That's a good term for it. Because the way LGBT narratives have permeated Western culture, it hasn't been slow. It's been rapid, almost overwhelming. It's reshaped public perception. These ideas are everywhere now.
Absolutely ubiquitous. Our sources show just how fast this happened. I mean, think about young adult books. In 2010, maybe 10 books with LGBT characters from mainstream publishers.
Okay, pretty small number.
By 2016, that number jumped to 80, an eightfold increase in just 6 years.
Wow. And it's not just books, is it?
Not at all. You've got drag queen story hours becoming common in public libraries, even some elementary schools. You see a huge increase in LGBT characters in films and kids' cartoons.
Especially after that 2015 Supreme Court decision in the U.S., Obergefell versus Hodges, the gay marriage ruling.
That seemed to really accelerate things. And then you have programs like OGY 123 in Canada, mandating LGBT education in schools. And our sources note they even used images of Muslim children in promotional material for that.
Which brings us back to that initial incident, doesn't it? That tension.
It does. And a key tool used in schools is this diagram, the genderbread person. Have you seen this?
Vaguely. It uses a gingerbread man, right?
Yeah, with a multicolored brain. It explains gender and orientation as fluid, based on self-perception, what a person's heart feels. It breaks down gender identity, gender expression, biological sex.
And the key thing, I imagine, is how it presents these.
Exactly. It presents what were traditionally seen as natural binaries, male-female, as a spectrum. And in doing so, one source argues, it effectively robs biological sex markers of any necessary connection or normative relevance. It fundamentally redefines these concepts.
The impact of that, especially on young Muslims in the West, must be profound.
It really is. Our sources describe many young Muslims feeling this way. I feel this way internally, therefore I'm an inauthentic person unless I'm allowed to live my life according to this feeling.
So this inner feeling becomes the ultimate truth for them.
Right. And if the Muslim community doesn't accept my sexual orientation, then they are rejecting me and undermining my dignity as a person. It captures that deep internal struggle caught between these two powerful worldviews.
And that pressure isn't just internal or domestic, is it? You mentioned it operates internationally, too.
Yeah, the sources talk about it as a kind of neo-colonial project. U.S. embassies, for example, actively pressuring Muslim countries during Pride Month, like the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait in June 2022, posting rainbow flag messages.
Which causes friction, obviously.
Definitely. But there's also pushback. You see things like Florida's 2022 law banning LGBT instruction in kindergarten through 3rd grade, or the backlash against that Burger King Pride Whopper in Austria.
The one with 2 top buns or 2 bottom buns?
That's the one. The company actually apologized later, calling it tone deaf. So it's not a one-way street, but the pressure is significant.
So if we zoom out a bit, try to understand the roots of this Western shift.
Yeah.
Where do the sources point?
Well, the most immediate cause, the proximate cause, is clearly the Western sexual revolution, late 1960s.
Right, a rejection of traditional Christian norms around sex.
Absolutely. Before then, premarital sex, homosexual acts, they were generally taboo. But the real game changer, according to their sources, the birth control pill, first marketed in 1960.
Because it separated sex from reproduction.
Exactly. It allowed for the divorce of sex from procreation. Before widespread effective contraception, society had, very strong practical reasons to keep sex within marriage, family stability, caring for children.
So the pill effectively blew apart, as one source puts it, the connections between sex, reproduction, marriage, and morality. They became free-floating variables.
That's the argument. And the basis for allowing sexual activity changed dramatically, from needing marriage to maybe just love or commitment.
And then by the 80s,
it came down to mere consent, just consent. And the sources argue this contributed to the demise of the nuclear family, leading to social issues like increased fatherlessness, single motherhood.
And it's this revolution, then, that spawned the gay liberation movement.
That's the connection made. It created, some argue, a false equivalence between this new idea of sexual liberation and the older struggle for racial civil rights, positioning sexual freedom seekers as an oppressed group in the same way.
But this wasn't just about the pill, right? The philosophical groundwork was laid much earlier.
Much earlier. Our sources trace it back centuries. From the 17th century onwards, a gradual drift in the West away from a theocentric, God-centered worldview.
Towards materialism, science as the only path to truth.
Right. God's hand was no longer seen in the workings of the world. Then the Enlightenment, 18th century, makes human reason the ultimate moral arbiter.
And by the 19th century, Nietzsche declares God is dead for Western culture.
Exactly. And then you have thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau back in the 18th century. A scholar named Carl Trueman argues Rousseau started the psychologization of the self.
Psychologization, meaning?
Meaning your identity, your true self, isn't defined by your role in society or your relationship with God, but by your inner feelings. Authenticity becomes expressing those feelings outwardly, whatever they are.
Okay, I see. And then figures like Marx, Nietzsche again, Freud. Their atheism, their focus on internal drives, especially Freud on the sex drive.
They all fed into this shift, paving the way for calls for radical sexual liberation from people like Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, leading to a situation where morality becomes, as one source says, a matter of taste, subjective.
Which is just fundamentally opposed to the Islamic view, where morality is objective, from God. And rejecting God, the Quran suggests, leads people to forget their true selves, worship their own desires.
Turning vice into virtue, even. Quran 59.19, 45.23, 35.8. These verses are cited as warnings against that very thing.
And interestingly, some of this shift wasn't just like accidental drift. Some of it was planned.
That's what's really striking. Our sources point to a 1989 book, After the Ball, by two Harvard-trained gay authors, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen.
A manifesto, basically.
Pretty much. A manifesto for normalizing homosexuality. They were explicit about their strategy. Unabashed propaganda, firmly grounded in long-established principles of psychology and advertising.
Wow. So using marketing techniques to change public opinion.
Yes. Their stated goal was desensitization through a flood of gay-related advertising and a planned psychological attack. It shows a real intentionality behind reshaping norms.
Which leads us to these different understandings of core moral concepts. What the sources call ersatz moral notions, substitutes, really.
Exactly. Because when divine command becomes irrelevant in public discourse, people create their own moral frameworks, often based on emotion or desire. Take freedom.
Okay. In the West, often seen as lack of constraints.
Right. The radical elimination of external barriers to what you want. But in Islam, freedom is found in servitude to God. Submitting to his will is seen as liberation from enslavement to desires or societal pressures.
Then individual autonomy. In the West, it's like giving oneself the law. You decide what's right for you.
Whereas in Islam, God and his messenger legislate. It's external divine guidance.
And authenticity, we touched on this. Western view. Express your inner self fully without restraint.
Islamic view. Find your true self by finding and submitting to your creator. That's where true authenticity lies.
Finally, consent. Hugely important in the West now. Often the only factor needed to legitimize sex.
Right. It often sidelines questions of moral character or virtue. But in Islam, consent is necessary, yes, but it's balanced with revelation, with protecting the family, with piety. These are seen as crucial for well-being, both individual and societal.
It's a completely different moral compass, really.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the Islamic framework itself. In stark contrast to these changing Western ideas, Islam presents, well, a timeless framework for gender and sexuality, grounded in revelation.
And a core principle there is the divine design of two genders, male and female, fixed.
Yes, stated clearly in the Quran, verses like 53.45, he who created pairs, the male and the female, or 75.39, and made of him pairs, the male and the female.
And importantly, Islamic law traditionally makes no distinction between biological sex and this modern idea of psychological gender.
So if you're born in a male body, the norm, the expectation, is you identify and act as male.
That's the general principle. A mismatch is seen as an exception, maybe like gender identity disorder or dysphoria, which needs perhaps a specific compassionate approach, but doesn't change the underlying binary principle.
The Quran stresses men and women are distinct but complementary, created as companions, spiritually equal.
Like in verse 33.35, listing believing men and women side by side.
But with different practical roles, rights, responsibilities in society and the family. Verses 4.34 are often cited here.
And this goes back to the idea of the body having a purpose, a teleology.
Exactly, a God-given design. So that slogan, my body, my choice, it's fundamentally at odds with the Islamic view because it denies that divine purpose and authority. It puts the individual's will above God's design.
Okay, so building on that, what about gender nonconformity? Acting in ways not typical for one's biological sex.
Islam generally obliges people to cultivate behavior aligned with their biological gender. And there's a strong prohibition against deliberate imitation of the opposite sex.
The prophetic saying, the curse on men who imitate women, and vice versa.
That's the one. But, and this is crucial, as our sources stress, this isn't talking about naturally effeminate men or naturally masculine women.
It's about deliberate impersonation.
Exactly. Like, drag queens may be the most conspicuous and exaggerated example of that deliberate choice, one source suggests, not about innate characteristics.
So it's the intention that matters, and context too, right? Norms change.
Hugely important. Islamic scholars consider urf, societal conventions, when determining what's masculine or feminine, and these vary massively across time and place.
Like the example you mentioned, 18th century American men's fashion.
Yeah. The wigs, the frills, the stockings. Looks like drag to us now, but it was masculine then. Islam isn't overly prescriptive on specifics. Girls can do sports, boys can do art or cooking.
And the Prophet's own life, the seerah, provides examples that challenged norms of his time, didn't it?
Absolutely. Men showing emotion, crying openly, women participating in battles, the Prophet himself doing household chores. These all push back against pre-Islamic Arab gender stereotypes.
And cultural context also explains things like, say, Arab men's friendships, holding hands, kissing sheiks. Totally platonic, but looks different through a Western lens.
It definitely highlights the role of culture. Now, shifting to broader sexual morality, Islam has this comprehensive system, right? All tied to the family as the foundation of society.
And unlawful sex, zina, is treated very seriously. A major sin, also a crime in Islamic law.
With very clear preventative measures built in. Lowering the gaze, dressing modestly, speaking modestly, avoiding being alone with someone you could potentially marry.
That's the concept of khalwa, private seclusion.
Right. And the underlying principle, one source states, is that all acts are forbidden by default unless specifically permitted by divine revelation.
Which includes specific prohibitions beyond just intercourse.
Yes. Anal intercourse, even between husband and wife, is generally forbidden. Sexual acts short of intercourse outside marriage, like manual or oral sex. Exposing intimate parts, the aura, except for necessity like medical treatment.
And the Quranic verse is very direct. And go not near zina. Verily, it is iniquity and an evil way. 17.32. Don't even go near it.
Exactly. It's about prevention. And a key reason for this strictness is the protection of family and lineage. Nas and Nasab.
Preserving lineage. Knowing who your parents are.
Crucial for things like inheritance rights, but also for the child's well-being, knowing their identity. Preventing Khalal al-Ansab, the mixing or confusion of lineage, is a major goal.
Which is why things like surrogacy, egg donation, sperm donation are generally prohibited in Sharia, because they introduce a third party into procreation.
Right, seen as tantamount to zina in that context. There might be a narrow exception for a married couple using only their own gametes for artificial insemination with the wife carrying the child, but the principle of protecting known lineage is paramount.
Okay, so that's the framework. Now let's turn to homosexuality and transgenderism specifically. The terms themselves are important here, aren't they?
Absolutely critical. As that principle says, passing judgment on something is contingent upon its proper conceptualization. You have to know what you're talking about first.
And the concept of homosexuality as an identity, gay, lesbian, queer, it's actually very new, isn't it? Specific to the modern West.
Very new. The term itself was coined as a medical term in Germany in the 1860s. Before that, in most cultures, sex was generally seen as something you do, an act, not something you are, an identity.
Right. Islam, like many older traditions, resists that modern, inextricable conflation of desire, behavior, and identity. The feeling, the act, and the identity aren't automatically fused together.
So what were historical attitudes towards same-sex acts or desires in the Muslim world? Our sources paint a, well, surprisingly nuanced picture.
Yeah, it wasn't monolithic. While the acts themselves might have faced legal condemnation based on interpretations of Scripture.
There was often a de facto social tolerance in many periods and places.
It seems so. And even a kind of cultivation of homoerotic themes in poetry and literature, starting quite early, around the 8th century. Think of poets like Abu Nuwas. There was a whole vocabulary for it.
And the understanding of attraction itself was different, more like ancient Greece or Rome.
Somewhat. The sources suggest classical Islamic texts sometimes reflect attraction from older men towards adolescent boys. And interestingly, the active role in male homosexual acts wasn't always as stigmatized as the passive role was for a mature man, which was seen as shameful.
And there are historical figures mentioned.
Yeah.
Caliphs, poets, even rulers like Mehmed the Conqueror.
Yes, figures like the Abbasid Caliph al-Amin, who reportedly preferred male company, or Mahmud of Ghazni and his famous relationship with his cupbearer Malik Ayaz. The 14th century poet Obaid Zakhani even wrote satire about the gap between strict laws and common practice. European sources mention Mehmed the Conqueror having ambivalent sexual tastes. It complicates the narrative.
So scholarly opinion varied back then. Just feeling attraction or writing poetry about it wasn't necessarily seen as wrong.
It seems many jurists didn't see the mere feeling or its poetic expression as illicit, as long as it wasn't acted upon in forbidden ways. But then, things changed. Modern Muslim public attitudes shifted significantly, starting mainly in the 19th century.
What caused that shift?
Our sources point to two main factors. One, the global rise of Islamic fundamentalist or revivalist movements, like Salafism and Wahhabism. They called for a much stricter adherence to certain interpretations of hadith.
So groups like the Wahhabis, for instance, imposed harsh penalties.
Yes, they criminalized homosexual acts, sometimes with the death penalty, like being thrown from minarets. That was a departure from the more varied approaches earlier.
And the second factor.
Influence from the West, ironically. Specifically, the sexual notions and restrictive norms prevalent in the Victorian Christian world, and the anti-homosexual laws imposed by European colonial powers.
Like the 1860 Indian Penal Code under the British.
Exactly. So the argument is that modern Muslim homophobia isn't just a straight line from classical Islam. It's actually a blend of certain traditional interpretations and these imported colonial-era frameworks.
That's a fascinating perspective. What about the scriptures themselves? How are they interpreted today? The Quran.
The story of Lot, or Lut, in Arabic is the clearest reference. Verses like 7.8084. Most traditional commentators agree the lewdness or fahisha mentioned there refers to attempted sodomy by the men of the town.
But there are other interpretations.
Yes, some modern scholars argue the main reason for the destruction of lost people wasn't homosexuality per se, but rather their rejection of the prophet, their arrogance, and specifically acts of sexual violence, attempted rape against Lot's guests. It's a point of debate.
What about other verses, like the Zina verse, 4.1516?
That verse talks about punishment for lewdness or illicit sexual acts. Most scholars apply it to heterosexual acts outside marriage, but a minority view throughout history did apply it to homosexual acts. Some even argue the prophet's own approach was more lenient, requiring only repentance.
And the Hadith, the sayings and actions of the prophet.
They tend to be more explicitly negative about homosexual acts, but their authenticity varies, and interpretation is key. Some hadiths seem to permit homoerotic feelings, if not acted upon, like one warning against gazing too intently at beardless youths.
And the punishments mentioned in early Islamic history.
There are reports attributed to the early caliphs, but they are often inconsistent. Some mention toppling walls on offenders, others burning, others stoning. The historical record is complex and not uniform.
Okay, let's shift to gender variance and transgenderism. Classical Islam had terms for this.
Yes, the literature mentions mukanathin, which usually translates to effeminate men, and mutarajila, masculine women. Some pre-modern scholars actually recognized the mukanathin if their effeminacy was seen as natural and not put on, as potentially a kind of third gender category.
And what about modern Islamic views on, say, sex reassignment surgery, SRS?
This is where it gets really interesting and diverse. You have prominent scholars like the late Grand Mufti of Egypt, Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi, and perhaps most famously, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, who issued fatwas, religious rulings, permitting SRS.
Khomeini, really? Given Iran's stance on homosexuality.
Exactly. His fatwa initially supported it for certain intersex conditions, but later was interpreted, including by him, to apply to transgender individuals too, which leads to this unique situation in Iran.
Where homosexuality is illegal, potentially punishable by death.
But gender transition is legal, recognized, and even subsidized by the government. Our sources mention reports of gay individuals allegedly undergoing SRS as a way to legally form relationships, typically heterosexual ones post-transition, and avoid persecution. It's a very complex reality.
What about other countries? Pakistan?
Pakistan has seen significant changes. Transgender people, the Khwaja Sira community, were historically marginalized. But in 2016, a major fatwa allowed transgender men and women to marry according to their identified gender. And a landmark 2018 bill granted rights like legal sex change, inheritance, voting. Significant progress, though challenges remain.
Turkey also accepts SRS generally.
Yes, Turkey is another Muslim-majority country where SRS is generally legally permissible in practice, though social acceptance varies. It really shows there isn't one single Muslim world approach.
But despite these nuances, the overall legal picture in many places remains quite harsh for LGBTQ plus people, right?
Very much so. As of 2025, our sources say homosexuality is still criminalized in 33 Muslim-majority countries.
And that includes the death penalty.
Yes, in 11 countries or regions, places like Brunei, Iran, Saudi Arabia, parts of Nigeria, Afghanistan under the Taliban, Yemen, usually based on specific interpretations of Sharia law. The status in Pakistan and Qatar regarding the death penalty specifically is noted as unclear or contested.
And in others, it's imprisonment or fines.
Right. Countries like Algeria, Bangladesh, Morocco, Egypt, Uzbekistan, though sometimes laws differentiate between male and female same-sex acts, enforcement also varies wildly.
From Egypt using vague morality laws to crack down.
To the horrific executions by ISIS throwing people off buildings, and even incidents in the West, like those Muslims in Derby, UK, convicted for distributing leaflets calling for the death penalty for homosexuals. It's a grim reality in many places.
But then you have countries where it's legal.
Yes, places like Albania, Turkey, Jordan, most of Indonesia outside of Aceh province. Same-sex acts are legal there, although same-sex marriage is generally not recognized across the Muslim world.
Though there have been exceptions, like that symbolic Islamic same-sex marriage in France.
Yes, and reports of gay-friendly mosques emerging, mostly in the West, like in Paris. It reflects the growing diversity and debate within Islam.
Which brings us to public opinion. You said it's polarized.
Deeply polarized. You hear strong condemnations, no good Muslim can be gay, alongside calls from within communities to address anti-gay attitudes and be more inclusive.
And the polls reflect this complexity.
They do. Pew Research back in 2013 showed widespread rejection of homosexuality in many Muslim-majority nations. Interestingly, in some places, younger generations were actually becoming more conservative on this issue then.
But that's changing, especially in the West.
Significantly, that same Pew Research, tracked over time in the U.S., showed acceptance among American Muslims jumping from just 27% in 2007 to 52% by 2017. That's a huge shift, putting them near the level of American Protestants.
In Germany, too.
A 2015 poll there found over 60% of Muslims supported gay marriage. So you see this real divergence between Muslim communities in different contexts.
Yet, despite these shifts in public opinion, many influential religious leaders maintain a traditional stance.
Yes. Prominent figures, both Sunni, like Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi before his passing, and Shia leaders like Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran and Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in Iraq, generally continue to condemn homosexual acts as sinful or sometimes frame it as an illness requiring treatment.
But parallel to that, there's this growing movement of LGBTQ-affirming Muslims.
Absolutely. Our sources highlight a growing number of organizations and even congregations, mostly in the West, but also in places like South Africa, that are explicitly LGBTQ affirming. They often identify with more liberal or progressive interpretations of Islam.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Groups like Hidayah in the UK, the Ibn Rushd Goethe Mosque in Berlin, which is known for being very liberal, the El Tawhid Juma Circle Unity Mosque in Toronto, Muslims for Progressive Values in the U.S. and Malaysia.
And there are openly gay imams now, too.
Yes. Figures like Muhsin Hendricks in South Africa, who founded the Inner Circle, Ludovic Mohammed Zahid in France, and Imam Dai Abdullah in the U.S., who founded the Light of Reform Mosque. They are really pushing boundaries from within.
But there's also pushback from the other side, groups trying to change sexual orientation.
Yes, there are ex-gay type organizations too, like the Straightway Foundation in the UK, which aim to guide Muslims with same-sex attractions towards heterosexuality, framing it as overcoming sinful desires. So the internal debate is happening on multiple fronts.
And this whole complex picture is reflected in popular culture, too. Books, films.
Definitely. You have anthologies like Islam and Homosexuality, where some writers, like Rasmir Music, talk about sexuality as a gift from a loving God. Scholars like Scott Siraj al-Haq argue in Progressive Muslims that Islam doesn't actually address homosexuality as a fixed identity and calls for a positive view of diversity.
Kisha Ali's work is also mentioned.
Yes, her book, Sexual Ethics in Islam, is noted for highlighting the significant disagreements among Muslims themselves on these issues. And then you have documentaries like A Jihad for Love or How Gay is Pakistan that explore the personal struggles and societal tensions on screen.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, You've heard today just how incredibly complex this conversation around Islam and LGBTQ plus issues really is. It's this rich tapestry, isn't it? Woven with threads of historical interpretation, shifting social norms, deep theological debates, and intensely personal experiences.
It really is. A field marked by incredibly strong convictions on all sides. You have calls for strict adherence to what's seen as timeless tradition, and equally passionate calls for radical reinterpretation, acceptance, and inclusion. Our sources show it's dynamic, often contradictory, but undeniably a critical dialogue for our times.
So given this intricate, often conflicting landscape that we've explored, how do we, as individuals just trying to be well-informed, navigate this tension? This tension between faith traditions emphasizing divine command, God's law, and these modern understandings of identity, authenticity, human rights that really champion individual autonomy.
Yeah, and what does it even mean to offer true guidance or support in this context when the very definitions of guidance support harm, flourishing? When those concepts themselves are so deeply contested and part of the ongoing discussion, that's maybe something to really reflect on.